Hey, Victor.
Yes, Chris.
Hey, we got another patron on Patreon.
And who is that?
That's Mr. Adam Culver.
Thank you, Mr. Adam Culver.
Thank you, Adam.
I'm Victor Polino.
And I'm Christopher Nottingham.
And you're listening to Civil Dissonance,
a show where we explore, engage, and dissect the topics that divide us as a society.
Today on Civil Dissonance, we'll be discussing
the Republican Party.
Hey, Chris.
Yes, Victor.
So, we've done a couple episodes now. We did one on conservatism, and we did one on liberalism.
We did.
Yeah. And we're going to try to do one on republicanism, I think.
Yeah, okay.
So let me ask you, what do you think a Republican is?
Ooh. Well, that's a tough question. When I look at Republicans in today's government and from my childhood, I just see old white people trying to undermine the lower class, the working class. That's the way I see the Republican Party.
I think a lot of people would probably see it that way. They definitely see the party of the old ideology. But I kind of feel like, from our other episodes, I've kind of learned a little bit more about it, and I kind of feel like it's maybe not how it started out. At least the idea because my idea of it is a little different. I see it as the party of big business, and that kind of that's kind of sad because we are talking about a party that for the longest time pushed ideals of freedom and equality, and now it seems like we have a different class of freedom and equality in what is being represented, and I feel like maybe classism is sort of what the Republican Party is standing for
today.
Yeah.
I can see what you're saying. It does feel as though the Republican Party is the party of big business, always promoting business over us, the citizens. To be fair, though, I kind of think almost the same of the Democratic Party. They just don't do it as blatantly.
Well, yeah, I don't really have a favorable view of any party or political process right now. I guess I do, but the Democrats are, as a political force, not any better, I guess, at least in my view. You're right, they have a better sales message right now, I think.
The Republican Party?
The Democratic Party.
Okay.
Yeah.
We have learned from our previous episodes that these views and ideologies have changed.
Yeah, they've altered a lot and are very similar in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not what the parties are today, but they were very similar in the past.
Their ideologies.
Yeah.
Yeah. At least with, in respect to conservatism and liberalism.
Yes. And I think about the headlines today, at least especially when it comes to, the Republican Party. Right now you have all this talk about how, the trade war with China and that we're getting into. And with that, you've got this, what's the ultimate motivation? Is it really to make America great? Or is it to line the pockets of a higher 1% in the U.S.?
History will tell.
Yeah, history will tell.
History's a very good truth seeker. So that being said, Victor, maybe, perhaps, I think it's that time.
To find a guest?
To find a guest.
All right. Well, whose turn is it?
I believe it's my turn.
All right. We'll go find us a guest.
Okay. Today we'll be speaking with Dr. Heather Cox Richardson. Dr. Richardson is a professor of history at Boston College, a co-host of NPR's Politics and History podcast, Freak Out and Carry On, a founder and editor of We'reHistory.org, and the author of 5 books, most recently, To Make Men Free, A History of the Republican Party. Hi, Heather. How are you doing today?
I'm good. How it's so good, to be here.
Well, thank you. Other than what I've already mentioned, can you tell our listeners a little bit more about yourself?
Of course. I think one of the things that matters when you think about the kind of history I do is to know that I'm actually from the country. I sort of have the gold star education with a private high school and all my degrees from Harvard. But I grew up in the country in a very small town. I still live there half time. And it's a town that is pretty evenly divided between Republicans and Democrats. So I've been on both sides of the political aisle there. And I spent a lot of time working in jobs that are not typical for people who have the kind of educational background I do. So I kind of stride across urban and rural and sort of white collar jobs and pink collar jobs. So I think I have a number of different perspectives that make the way I look at history maybe a little bit different than other people's might be.
Where are you from?
I'm from Maine. I'm from a little town in Maine where my family's been from since before the Pilgrims. They came as fishermen and they stayed as fishermen for a very, very long time. Fishermen and maritime guys.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah. You know, it's fun. You know, you guys are probably some of your listeners are in the country. You know, when you're from a town where your family's been from forever, you know, you learn to swim on the same rock where your great grandmother learned to swim. And, you know, my partner, to be honest, somewhere way back in the early days, we were related. So our families were related. He doesn't like me to tell that story, but we do get the small town thing and the importance of a connection to your land and your town and your people and your country in a way that I think is maybe unusual in more urban areas in the 21st century.
So, Heather, what does it mean to be a Republican?
Well, of course, that's a really complicated question because it has meant different things at different times. And right now, it means really different things to different people. What I would say is that a true Republican, that's a Republican in the mold of Abraham Lincoln, who is the first man to articulate what the Republican Party should stand for. It knew what it stood against in the 1850s, but it didn't know what it stood for. And Lincoln is the person who articulated what it stood for. It was really a traditional conservative party in the mold of really the father of conservatism, Edmund Burke. And what that stands for is stability. You know, a society that changes. It does progress, but it changes according to facts on the ground. Policy should reflect really considered reality and argument to move in such a way that the government protects property, it protects family, it protects social structures, with the idea that people need to be able to buy into their country, to feel like they belong to their country. So what this translated to for somebody like Lincoln was the idea that the government needed to promote equality of opportunity. You had to make sure people at the bottom could make it, could work hard and make it, or else they would not feel like they belonged to the country and they would overthrow the government. You know, they would eventually take over the government. And what Lincoln was most concerned about was that in his day, the government was really loading the dice, if you will, for a very small group of very rich people. And those were the Southern slaveholders, who were about 1% of the population. And by the late 1850s, they really were calling all the shots. They'd packed the courts. They had taken some elections that they shouldn't have. They were kind of taking all the country's resources and making it really impossible for regular guys to work hard and rise. If they were lucky, they were ending up as wage workers, but many of them couldn't find jobs. So Lincoln was very concerned about that. And what he really wanted to do was to stop this takeover of the government by this small group of slaveholders and create a government that really protected equality of opportunity. So they did a lot of things early on in the Republican Party. They, of course, were fighting the Civil War, but many people don't realize that they put regular farmers on land. They gave through the Homestead Act, which gave you land if you were willing to farm it. They invented our system of education, our higher education. They provided a means for funding universities so that regular people could get educations. They put in place the Department of Agriculture to make sure that farmers could have access to really good quality seeds. And they chartered the Pacific Railroad so that people could get out to the West so they could farm and mine. And of course, they ended up abolishing slavery because they wanted to make sure that there were no legal barriers to anybody who was willing to work hard being able to rise. They did all that, and they also made sure that everybody had to pay into the government. A lot of people don't know that the Republican Party actually invented American national taxation, including the income tax. So when I look at what it means to be a Republican, I look at this sort of Burkean conservative notion of everybody paying their way to the degree that they are able to, so the wealthy pay more than the poor, and the government works to keep the playing field level between people at the bottom and people at the top so that anybody can work hard and rise without the system being gamed. So that's really what it means to be a Republican sort of ideologically. What it means to be a Republican today, though, is a different thing, because that vision that I just outlined is really the vision that the vast majority of Americans had coming out of World War II. FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the Democratic president, had put in place an activist government that really tried to guarantee that people at the bottom could work hard and survive, and that they had some protections in their old age, and that the really wealthy couldn't take everything the way they had in the 1920s. And after World War II, Dwight Eisenhower, who I think still think is one of our greatest presidents, he doesn't get the credit he should. I mean, in addition to World War II, for God's sake, he adhered to this idea of government helping everybody out. And most Americans, Democratic and Republicans, believed that. It was called the liberal consensus, and it was not big L liberal, which comes later. It was this idea that the government had to keep its thumb on the playing field so that nobody got too much, neither at the top nor at the bottom, but that everybody had an equal shot at opportunity. And there were a number of men who really didn't like that, and they were big businessmen from the 1920s who really resented the government regulations that made them, pay a minimum wage or have workers' protections in place or not be able to pollute. And they really resented that, and they wanted to get away from that. They said, we know how to treat our workers, we know how to run our businesses, and you people have the government has no business regulating that at all. And so they tried to sell this idea that the liberal consensus, the FDR's New Deal and Eisenhower's middle way, was anti-American, and it was destroying America, and it was communism. And I can explain to you if you care about how they say it's communism. I'd like to point out that this is one of the most vibrant and powerful economic periods in America. So everybody's doing incredibly well. And they say that this is destroying America. And most Americans look at them and like, you guys are nuts. We're really happy. Things are going great. And then in 1954, the Supreme Court hands down the Brown v. Board of Education decision, which says that schools have to desegregate. And Eisenhower in 1957 gets behind that concept of desegregation, and he sends troops into Little Rock, Arkansas to desegregate Central High School there. And when that happens, these guys who don't want business regulation say, we told you that the active federal government was not really about protecting the little guys at the bottom. It was about helping black people. We told you that all along, that this is what was going to happen. And when they add that piece in, Southerners especially listen, white Southerners especially listen, and they say, oh man, maybe you're right. We don't want to integrate schools. And from that period, and that's really only happening in the 1950s, and I can walk you through the rest of it, but these guys started to get traction. And what has happened since then, first, as I say, nobody was paying attention. And if you want to talk about the history of this, I can. But they get more and more traction until that group of people who deliberately called themselves movement conservatives and who said, listen, we're not small c Burkean conservatives like Lincoln. We are radicals. We want to change the system. We want to get rid of this consensus that everybody likes. those people have taken over the GOP. They've taken over the Republican Party. And, one of the things that I've done in my work is to try to say, this is really not republicanism. Like, if you want to believe this stuff, fine, and I can tell you how we got here. But this is not traditional republicanism. It's kind of this, I've called it a cabal. It's an ideological movement that says we simply believe that the government should do absolutely nothing but promote big business, Christianity, and have a big military. Now, if you want to believe that, we can argue it, but admit that's what you believe. That's not and has never been what traditional republicanism under people like Abraham Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, and Eisenhower ever stood for. So there's a really long answer to what it means to be a Republican historically, and maybe what it means to be a Republican now. And those two things are almost diametrically opposed.
Wow. So, Heather, what do you think happened? I mean, how did these radical Republicans seize power and get to where they are today? Would you describe as the Republican Party is nothing like how I or probably a good number of people understand the Republican Party to be today?
Yes, I understand that. And it breaks my heart because the Republican Party. Do you mind if I take that question in a little bit different direction?
No, go ahead.
So, I'm a historian. I do talk about politics, but I always talk about politics in the content of history. As I say, I have my people are on both sides of this fence, of the political fence. And I don't, in specific races, I definitely have a dog in the fight, but I'm not. I always joke I'm there with the armadillos in the middle of the room. And I'm sorry, in the middle of the road. And I really believe that as a country, we need to have a strong, healthy Democratic Party. And I could talk about the Democrats, but you haven't asked me to. So let's just leave it at that. And a strong, healthy Republican Party, because they are not opposite to each other. They're very different. They rose at different times. And because of the way they rose, the Democrats historically have argued that the country has the pie is limited and that power and wealth invariably will move upward. And what the government needs to do is to push back against that and make sure the people at the bottom always have a fair shake. So they kind of see the world as us and them. The Republicans rose 30 years later. And what they always argued was that the society was a web, that if you made it clear that people at the bottom could have access to opportunity, not everybody, not equality of outcome, not everybody would make it, not everybody was going to end up incredibly wealthy, but that everybody had a chance, that if you did that, that most people would create more than they could use, that they and their families could use. And their surplus capital, if you will, and early Republicans actually called capital pre-exerted labor. That was actually their definition for capital. That capital would support merchants and, artisans, people making goods to trade. And they too would create more than they could consume. And that money in turn would go to the very top. And you might have some big manufacturers, big businessmen who of course would hire people at the bottom to work for him. And this whole cycle would keep on going. So everybody had an interest in the same economic growth, and there was an economic harmony in the country, according to the Republicans. Now, those two ideologies that I have outlined are not opposites at all. Like every once in a while, you'll have an election where the parties really do seem like they're yin and yang, if you will, but it's kind of rare. They're kind of playing, one's playing with a basketball and one's playing with a football. And you're because they see the world so differently. And I would argue that both of those visions have been incredibly important to America at different times. And we need those two visions and we need to have them both healthy. So when you look at the Republican Party today, and again, you haven't asked me to talk about the Democrats. I could say a lot about the Democrats as well. But if you look at the Republican Party today, they've really lost that sense of we're all in this together. And what you've got is what happens periodically in American history since the rise of the Republican Party. You've got them kind of trying to use that language, the idea that if you protect people at the top, they're going to hire people at the bottom. It's not quite the same, though, because the original Republicans are not talking about trickle down. They're talking about making sure everybody has opportunity at the bottom, and that's a different thing. But you have some of that language, but you now have the party doing what it has done three times before, in the 1890s, in the 1920s, and now in the present, which is kind of, corrupting that vision and instead saying what we really have to do is protect the extremely wealthy because they're really the only ones who know how to run society, and they're really kind of better than the rest of us. And when that happens, when the Republicans do that and have control of the country, it's always a mistake. We always get a major depression. We had the Panic of 1893. Of course, we had the Great Depression, and I'm terrified about the present. 2008 didn't look very good because it's simply not possible to have the government working for only the very wealthy, and have the economy survive because the vast majority of people can't afford to do anything. So every time this happens, it kind of breaks my heart because the Republican Party won the Civil War. It kept this country together, and it promoted some of our greatest periods in America, the early 20th century with Teddy Roosevelt, and the 1950s, which were incredible, and into the 1960s when some of the problems of the post-World War II era caught up with the government. It presided over those things, and the fact that people are sort of throwing that overboard and saying, oh, no, we just want to move wealth upward because we care so much that we're Republicans, it just breaks my heart because Republicans should stand for something more than that.
I can't argue with that. I would say the same thing about, the Democratic Party or anybody really, but Democrats. So you kind of touched on it a little bit. What is the difference between a Democrat and a Republican?
Well, I did touch on it a little bit because my point was simply that they're not opposites. They're different. They rose at different times. And the Democrats really rise in the 1830s. The Republicans rise in the 1860s, but the Democrats rise in the 1830s, and they form around Andrew Jackson. And they form around the idea that the government should not be used to move all the money upward, which is what Jackson insisted was happening. And there's a sleight of hand here. Jackson actually was perfectly fine with money moving upward so long as it moved upward into the hands of slaveholders like him. He just didn't want it to move upward into the hands of northern merchants and bankers. But be that as it may, the Democrats have adopted this ideology. And again, these are the fundamental ideologies of the party. At different times, they get pretty fuzzy. And I think that you could make an argument that the Democratic Party has gotten really quite fuzzy at different periods. Perhaps the present would be a time as well. But the idea behind the Democrats was that the government should not be used to push money upward, which is what Jackson thought it was doing, that its job was to make sure that people at the bottom had a fair shake, that everything didn't go to the very rich. And that has played out in really different ways over time, but that's the fundamental idea behind the Democratic Party.
Huh. We're going to do an episode in the future, hopefully soon, about the Democratic Party. We've done an episode on liberalism and conservatism, and one of the things that we noticed with those episodes was a lot of the similarities in the ideologies between conservatives and liberals. And I'm thinking once we do the Democratic Party episode, we'll also see those similarities, such as that you've been talking about. I think at the base and for what they really want for the people of America, it's a lot of the same thing. It's just how to go about it.
I think that's right. I think, and not only how to go about it, but what is the role of government? Those are different things. What is the role of government in promoting the kind of society that you want to have? One of the things that's problematic when you talk about liberals and conservatives is that those terms have changed so dramatically over time. And the Republican Party had a lot to do with that. So a traditional liberal, a small L liberal, came from came out of British history, and the primary idea behind a liberal was to keep government really small, because if you had a big government, it would impede an individual's ability to be the best that he could be. And so liberalism in America until the 1890s is an attempt to keep the government really small. But under Teddy Roosevelt, the Republican Roosevelt, at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, he looked at the rise of industrialization and said, wait a minute here. We have different circumstances in America now. And with the rise of these giant industries, Carnegie Steel and things like that, the individuals can't be their best because they're getting squished by these extremely powerful men. So it's under Roosevelt that the idea shifts, that in order to make sure an individual has the best opportunity to work hard and rise, the government needs to be active. And a liberal still is protecting the ability of an individual to rise, but recognizes after Roosevelt that you need government intervention to regulate business and to provide education and make it possible for that individual to rise. So that's one way in which the word liberal is confusing, because it switches its definition at the turn of the last century. But then, as I say, after World War II, these movement conservatives, and this happened really deliberately in a book written by William F. Buckley Jr. and his brother-in-law, L. Brent Bazell, that was published, I believe it's in 1954, right after the Army McCarthy hearings, when Senator Joe McCarthy accused the Army of harboring communists and had these televised hearings where he tried to argue that communists had infiltrated the government. And of course, his browbeating of people gave us the word McCarthyism, because he was attacking people simply to blacklist them. He didn't have any evidence. Anyway, after that, they wrote a book called McCarthy and His Enemies. And what they said in that book was that, well, McCarthy might have been wrong and he might have been kind of a bully, but he was ultimately right, because all the Americans, Democrats and Republicans who believed in the New Deal or who believed in Eisenhower's middle way were essentially communists, because what they were arguing was that the government needed to step in and regulate business and promote equality of opportunity. And the only way that the government could have a bureaucracy that would do that was through taxes. So you needed to have taxes in order to have government regulation and in order to have schools and roads and infrastructure, the things that FDR and Eisenhower had put in place. And in order to do that, you had to pay for it with tax dollars. And that, therefore, was going to be a redistribution of wealth from people who had money to people who didn't have money. And what Buckley and Bazell said in McCarthy and His Enemies were that anybody who believed in the New Deal or in Eisenhower's middle way was a liberal, a capital L. And they used that word to mean anybody who believed that the government should regulate business or promote equality of opportunity. And they used a capital L because they wanted to make it sound like the Communist Party in China, which was spelled with a capital C. Communism didn't have a capital until the Communist Party in China, and then it was the communists with a capital C. And in contrast to that, they said, we are conservatives with a capital C. And they said, this is not Burkean conservatism. We're a party that says the government should do none of those things. They were essentially libertarians, and that we are conservatives, and we just believe that this is, we believe that this is what the government should do. Everybody else is one of the bad guys. They're a liberal. And this is where we get the idea from right here, and from an earlier book, a 1951 book by William F. Buckley Jr. called God and Man at Yale, that the media is liberal, because the media was, of course, saying that it made sense to regulate business or to put in new schools or whatever. And it still does, because most of those arguments are fact-based arguments. You need to do these things. And therefore, but anybody who is willing to admit there is any role in government, for government, that either regulates business or promotes social welfare or equality of opportunity, is, to a movement conservative, a communist, somebody who is trying to destroy American society. And that's gotten really confusing, because you get people saying, oh, well, today, you get people saying, oh, well, the media is liberal, or, all schools are liberal. And what people today mean when they say that is those people vote Democratic. But in fact, what it came from was this idea that anybody who believes the government has any role in protecting, the environment or education or any of those things is somehow antithetical to this idea that the government should do none of those things. So it's gotten really confusing. Plus, you have the problem of true conservatives, like Burkean conservatives like Abraham Lincoln and all those people, and the movement conservatives, like Paul Ryan, who says, no, the government should not be involved in Social Security or Medicare or health care or roads or schools or anything, because all of that is essentially a form of redistribution of wealth through taxation.
So movement conservatives, you've mentioned them a few times, and I think you've explained it, but separately from everything else, can you kind of go over what a movement conservative is?
So, yeah, again, coming out of World War II, the vast majority of Americans, let me actually step back. The 1920s looked really good on paper, but the reality was there was this incredible bubble that was really pushed by a number of government policies that basically slashed all regulation, got rid of taxes, moved all the money up in American society, created this big bubble. And there's this incredible crash, of course, in 1929, and we get the Great Depression. And the Great Depression stretches on. FDR tries to address it, and it's really World War II that manages to bring America out of that depression. And actually, that's fiscally, it's actually a really interesting story, but probably only to me and about 7 other people. But anyway, it's for me. I just American history is such an incredibly rich, wonderful thing, and you can hear me talking in the present tense when I talk, even about the ancient Republican Party, and I say we are, just because it's like this great pageant spread out in front of me, and I can't believe I am fortunate enough to get paid to do this, I gotta say. But so coming out of, so there's this terrible crash, and it's bad. I mean, people are starving. People live in Hoovervilles, that is paper shacks on the outside of cities that they blame the president for, and his name is Hoover, so they live in Hoovervilles. Most people are terribly underemployed if they're employed at all. It really looks like America is ripe for revolution. There's people in the streets, high rates of suicide, high rates of family desertion. I mean, it's a terrible, terrible time. And FDR and Herbert Hoover, who's the president when this all happens, although it is not his fault. I mean, Hoover's a really interesting character, but he inherits this mess, and he kind of knows it's a mess, but it all crashes on his watch. And he says, listen, the government really can't fix this. And he does a few things. He tries to do a few things, but basically he says, people just gotta tough this out. And the reality is people couldn't tough it out. They're losing their homes. They can't sell. The farmers can't sell any of their goods, because what's happened is you have a new national and international economy. And when it goes, all of a sudden everything goes at once. So Hoover says, you guys got to tough it out. And the people reject him overwhelmingly in the election of 1932. And they elect Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who is a Democrat from New York. And FDR says, listen, I don't know quite what we're going to do, but I know we got to do something. And he starts what is called the New Deal, in which he puts in place a vast number of new policies to try and regulate business and jumpstart the economy. And part of that is he's trying to make sure that the very wealthy can't game the system the way they did in the 1920s to destroy the economy. So that we get, for example, FDIC, which is the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which guarantees nowadays that your bank accounts are backed by the government, that the bank can't simply close and take all your money, which is what happened in the 1920s. We get these protections. We had a protection that kept savings banks and commercial banks from merging so that you couldn't lose all your savings, which of course we've gotten rid of, and it's one of the reasons we had such a problem a few years ago. He put a lot of he and Congress put a lot of programs in place, minimum wages, and Social Security was one of their programs. with the idea of making sure that people at the top couldn't take everything, but also that people at the bottom had some basic protections, workplace protections, wage protections, some guarantees that they were not going to end up eating out of garbage cans the way they had been doing 10 years before. And most Americans love this. They love this system. And then when Eisenhower comes in, Eisenhower is like, well, yeah, this works. You know, we've stabilized the economy. We've stabilized the country. And this is absolutely the way to go. Although maybe I think business ought to have a little bit more headroom. At the beginning of his presidency, he thought that. He pulled back on that later on. But most Americans were like, yeah, you know, in this new multinational world, you do need to have a government that guarantees basic wages, basic safety, education, and health care. Eisenhower it's actually Teddy Roosevelt who first says Americans should have universal health care, but it's Eisenhower who actually comes up with the first plan for it. It gets killed in Congress by Democrats, believe it or not. But Eisenhower and FDR believe in this activist government that regulates business so it can't, you know, screw over people basically, and guarantee sort of a basic bottom so that people can also work hard and rise, and that there'll be a cushion at the end. You know, they put in, you know, Social Security, for example, so that you don't have to depend on your children in this era. So, and that you're not going to starve out of when you're old. Is a sort of a great story about a man looking out of his window and seeing elderly women eating out of garbage cans and saying, you know, this can't be in America. But anyways, so most people think this is great. I mean, they argue about the edges of it, but they agree. Most Americans agree that the government has a role to play in protecting the stability of society and of the economy. But you know exactly where this is going. A few big businessmen who did just fine in the 1920s and loved having no regulations, hate the New Deal. They don't like to pay taxes, but surprisingly enough, it's not taxes they're upset about. They don't like business regulations. They want to be able to do whatever they want with their businesses, and they want to pay their workers whatever they want, and they don't want to have to worry about the environment, and they don't have to want to have to worry about anything other than what they think makes sense. And they say that this is good for everybody because they are sort of like patriarchs, paternalistic. They're going to take care of their workers so long as their workers are good workers. And if they're not, they'll just get fired or whatever. And they try and convince people that the New Deal is a bad thing. And most Americans look at them and they're like, yeah, nice try, folks. We tried that in the 1920s. And, you know, we remember, you know, starving, and we don't think that's a good way to go. So you can just take that and put it where the sun don't shine. And no one's paying much attention to that. We get William F. Buckley Jr.'s first book, God and Man at Yale in 1951, lays this out, and he says, listen, we got a real problem here because his father, by the way, is a big oil man. Because Americans have been brainwashed into this. They are making the mistake of following, and he actually writes this in the book, following the principles of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment says you should have that you should base society on arguments, that everybody should get informed, and you should have reasoned arguments, and that if you put facts in front of people, they will make the right choices about policies. And Buckley in this book says, well, we've proven this wrong because Americans are overwhelmingly choosing the New Deal. And therefore, the Enlightenment must be wrong. The subtitle of that book is called The Superstition of Academic Freedom. And academic freedom is premised on the idea that if you argue, you'll get to a good conclusion. So he says, we got to do something about this. We have to push back against this idea that the New Deal is a good idea. And again, he writes this book, and it's published by this little tiny press, and no one pays any attention. And then 3 years later, he and his brother-in-law write McCarthy and His Enemies. And that's where he lays out this idea that conservatives, movement conservatives like him, need to declare war on the New Deal and on, at that point, Eisenhower's in office, so also Eisenhower's middle way, because what most Americans want, this government that holds the great middle, is in their minds an attack on private property, because people like William F. Buckley Jr.'s father is going to have to be regulated and is going to have to pay taxes, and he doesn't want any part of that. So he does that, and then in 1955, he starts National Review, the magazine National Review, and he claims it's a grassroots movement, but it's actually bankrolled by his father and two other very wealthy businessmen. And again, it doesn't really go very far, and it's really a poor effort in its early years. And he vows in that he's going to tell the untold businessman's side of the story, and he's going to stick up for big business. And then, as I say, it doesn't really get much traction. And then you have the civil rights movement. And with the civil rights movement, what the movement conservatives say is that the government efforts to protect equality of opportunity for African Americans in the 1950s, something that was very near and dear to Eisenhower's heart, that what they do is they tie racism into this argument that an activist government that's protecting people at the bottom is just redistributing wealth from the wealthy to the poor. But they're saying, hey, look, it's redistributing wealth from the wealthy to the poor, but the poor are black. So this is money going from white people to black people. And when they start doing that, it starts to get traction. And you can really see this in 1960 when Brent Bazell writes Conscience of a Conservative for Barry Goldwater. It's under Barry Goldwater's name, but it's written by Bazell. And in that he says, listen, the government has no role in protecting black rights. And this whole civil rights thing is unconstitutional. And when that happens, Goldwater, it doesn't run in 60. He publishes a book in 60, but when he runs in 64 and gets the GOP nomination in 64, he loses in a landslide, but he wins his home state of Arizona, and he also wins 5 of the deep southern states who will vote for him based on his racial stance. And one of the people who switches sides from being a Democrat to being a Republican in 64 is Strom Thurmond. And in 68, when Richard Nixon is running, and Richard Nixon's got really big problems because the country is so divided and he has to hammer together a coalition, he goes to Strom Thurmond and he says, I really would like your support. And he says, I'll give you my support, but you got to promise that this racial stuff is going to, this desegregation is going to stop. And Nixon says basically, okay. And that's what becomes known as the Southern Strategy. And that is what really gives movement conservatism traction in the Republican Party. And of course, Nixon tries to walk a middle line, and then you know what happens with Nixon with Watergate, and then we get Carter. But then Ronald Reagan really hammers on this with his welfare queen stuff. And he's really the one who hits that hardest. And he is ideologically a movement conservatism. He's conservative. He signed on to the National Review early on, said John F. Kennedy was a communist, but he didn't govern as a movement conservative, which is why people can make the case that he raised taxes, which he did, and he actually governed much more moderately than he talked. But then once you had Reagan in there, you had this fight in the Republican Party between more traditional Republicans in the Eisenhower mold, people like George H.W. Bush, the first President Bush, who was sort of trying to use the government in some positive ways. And he's faced with a revolt in his own party led by Newt Gingrich and Grover Norquist, who just say no new taxes under any circumstances, because what we're going to do is we're going to starve this government until it has no money to do anything. And we're going to get it back to that 1920s government. And then, of course, I think I don't really need to play this through. George W. Bush, with his extraordinary tax cut before he even took office, he proposed I think it was $1 trillion tax cut. He didn't get that entire thing, but he got something like it. And they said quite openly in the newspapers that they were doing this so they could get up the tracks and blow up the government. And of course, now we have the problem of this current tax cut we've just had go through, and now we're looking to pay for it to the degree we can by the president's new budget, which is only a a signal document. It really won't go into print, into policy the way it is, but basically it calls for some serious slashing to major programs like Medicare and Medicaid. And I think the ultimate goal is exactly that of the movement conservatives, to get rid of the concept of a government that can regulate business or protect equality of opportunity or provide a basic social safety net, and go back to the 1920s. The reason that people like me think it's a terrible idea is we know what happened in the 1920s, and a different kind of government has worked very, very well since then. So the idea that somehow we're going to, move ourselves back 100 years and in the 21st century that's going to be a good thing looks to a lot of historians like it's kind of a pipe dream.
Wow. Wow.
I'm sorry. I do love this stuff.
No,
you can cut me as however you wish.
No, we were just sitting here enjoying listening to you. I mean, that is some good information. Yeah.
It's so funny because when you work in broad brush stuff like I do, it's so clear to me, and I wish I could bring it to life for your listeners, because I know these people. I've read all their writings. I see what they're doing. And, when I wrote my last book, some people would say, oh, she's just this crazy liberal. And, capital L liberal who votes Democratic. And the bottom line is that, I'm not making this up. They said these things. If you look in that book, you will see, and I cut the footnotes. You'll see, dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of direct quotes and citations. And I cut a lot of them. They weren't shy about what they were doing because they really believed it. And even now, when people seem surprised at, I had something on Twitter the other day about, we passed this big tax cut, and people seem surprised that now, the Speaker of the House is saying, well, now we have to cut the budget and we have to cut Medicare and Medicaid and things like that. And people are surprised. And I'm like, why are you surprised? He's been saying this forever. And it's completely in keeping with his ideology. And if you believe in that ideology, more power to you. I don't believe in it, but let's at least acknowledge that they're not hiding their cards. They believe in this. They think it's the right thing for America. And that's what's on the table right now.
You would think, and it just seems to make sense that we would all want to look at history to see what has happened, to understand, how certain things have become the way that they are and how we fixed them and how not to go back to that. But in talking about history and people writing about history, what are your thoughts about historical negationism?
What do you mean by historical negationism?
So the way that I understand historical negationism is it's illegitimate historical revisionism. So it's kind of like perverting a historical fact with other points of views and pushing it as empirical.
Oh, okay. I have thoughts on this, and another historian would give you a different set of thoughts about it, I suspect. But I've thought deeply about this, and history is the study of how and why things change. And in order to do history right, in order to understand how things change, you can't lie to yourself. You can't lie about what you see and what is there, and often that takes a real historian in directions that he or she did not intend to go and might not like the outcome, by the way. And but if you're really going to understand how societies change, you have to be honest with yourself and you have to say, gee, this is not how I thought things happen, but I'm looking at all the evidence in front of me, and what I am seeing is not what I expected to see. And that happens to me again and again and again. And there is an argument, and this is not specific, I think, to any place on the political spectrum. I think people on the right do it. I think people on the left do it as well. And that is that because they want a particular outcome today, they look into the past and they say, oh, look, here's a great example. Oh, look, the founding fathers were all Christians and this is supposed to be a Christian nation. That's just wrong. I don't care if you're a Christian or not. That's just wrong. And the problem with saying that is that it perverts the way societies work. You could say that and say, I'm being a politician right now, and I think it's very important that today people are Christians. And you would be honest. But if you say I'm going to explain historical change by perverting what the founding fathers were up to, you have lost your ability to understand how societies change and make good decisions about those things today. So I'm a real stickler for being able to cite your sources and prove your arguments. And if you are wrong, that you correct them. But because I think that history has very much a present use, because it says to us, this is how things have happened in the past. We should at least keep an eye out for this right now. But if you have perverted that, you can't make that argument anymore. You don't know how things were in the past. And this is something I hit on with my students again and again and again, is you might want something to look in a certain way today because of the way the political world is today. But that's very different than doing history, because if you're doing history, you're really doing history for the future as well as for the past, and you don't in the present, and you don't know what the future needs out of this history. So the fact that you have perverted something in the present day of 2020 or 2018 in order to make your point now means that 200 years from now, people might be looking back at that moment and saying, oh crap, now we're associated with this, and now it's a bad thing. So I'm afraid that was really kind of a fuzzy way to talk about this, but history is its own master. And I have to say there are many things in history that I don't like for the present. And there are many things about what I study that I actually vote differently on in the present. But they are, to me, very different things. Politics is the business of what is happening in our world today. History is a study of how societies change. And history can inform politics, but politics should never inform history in my book.
I like it.
Well, it's a hard sell for an awful lot of people anywhere on the spectrum, because people want to marshal evidence, and you can cherry pick absolutely anything you want. I can, you give me a topic and I can make an argument based on it. But that's a very different thing than providing something useful to see what actually creates change. I mean, one of the things that fascinates me about the present in terms of creating change is one of the things that we see again and again and again when we get an income distribution the way things are in America today, which has only happened a few times in the past, is we get real civil unrest, as in riots, lots of them. And I don't like riots for any reason. I'm a mom, right? And I look at this and I think, how can the people making these laws not worry about that? How can people not worry that that's coming? Because everything that we've got out there in American history says it is coming. And that seems to me to be a useful piece of information to bring to the present, looking at history. There are a million wonderful things, and there are a million wonderful stories about the Republican Party. But I think the one thing that I wish more people grabbed hold of was the fact that Dwight Eisenhower was a Republican. He is the mind behind the winning of World War II. And he came out of World War II and he had this vision of a society that promoted equality of opportunity for people at home and for people around the world. And yes, I know he made mistakes when he did that. But the fact that Dwight Eisenhower is sort of thought of in popular culture as like Elmer Fudd just breaks my heart, because I've read at this point, widely in all of American presidents, but certainly all of the Republican presidents. And I will tell you that Eisenhower had a mind that was on a par with Abraham Lincoln's. And the fact that we treat him like he is somehow just a golfer just really bothers me. So if there is one thing that I would like listeners to know about the Republican Party, is that Dwight Eisenhower was a Republican, and it's worth learning more about him because he was quite an impressive man.
Would you like to tell us about your book, To Make Men Free, A History of the Republican Party?
Sure. It follows this whole history of the party. And it lays out the argument that the party goes through a number of cycles where it first tries to promote equality of opportunity, and then there's a backlash against that, really coming from some of the weird things that were in place during Reconstruction, that the party kind of sort of becomes racist and anti-immigrant, and then it ties itself to big business, and then there's an economic crash, and then it starts all over again. So the interesting thing about it is that I have predicted for a long time that the Republican Party was in the process of being reborn, that it had reached a place that it was unsustainable, where it was helping people at the very top and no longer promoting equality of opportunity. And in the past, when that's happened, we have gotten a new, brilliant, progressive Republican like Teddy Roosevelt or like Eisenhower. And I hold to that idea. I would love to see one of those younger people emerging, and right now I'm not seeing them, but I am not one of those people who thinks that the Republican Party is ending. You know, if it ended tomorrow, it would be reborn in less than 2 months with that sort of circular ideology that I talked about as being so important to America. And it's kind of a book that looks at all these stories, which I loved, and unfortunately I couldn't include some of the best stories, but also sort of maybe maps out a future for the party as well. So it was kind of a fun trip through American history, looking at a party that has been so vital to it.
Well, Heather, I really appreciate you being on the show. Very insightful, very informative. I think we've all had sort of a journey tonight with the Republican Party. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Chris. It's been a lot of fun.
If you like what you hear, you can help us out by funding our efforts and keeping the show ad-free.
You can do that by donating at our Patreon page at patreon.com/civilDissonance, or by following the link on our website and in our show notes.
You can also show support to our guests by purchasing their books and other works. You can find a list with links on our website under Guest Works.
That was an amazing interview.
Yes, Dr. Richardson was fantastic.
A lot of information, a wealth of information. That was really informative.
We could have had like 18 episodes off of just this one interview.
She covered a lot of stuff. And very knowledgeable. Very knowledgeable.
Yeah, I was fascinated with just this idea of, how the Republican Party and the Democratic Party are, they're not so opposed in the beginning, so opposed, and how they just have different concepts of how to get to the same point.
Yeah. Yeah. And another thing that keeps popping up, equality of opportunity. Equality of opportunity. This is the third episode where equality of opportunity has been mentioned.
Yeah. And it's largely a Republican ideology.
I think it's both liberalism conservatism.
Yeah.
I don't think it's exclusively Republican.
Oh, no, but I think she spoke about how, the Democratic Party sold us a pie and there was only a limited amount.
Yeah.
And how the Democrats believe that no matter what happened, wealth would always move upward and it wouldn't come down. So you have to regulate it in a certain way.
Yeah.
And the Republicans believed in the idea of the equality of opportunity. So they believed that as long as you kept the playing field level, then the wealth would come back down.
I think what a lot of people confuse equality of opportunity for, and I'm glad she mentioned it. I've never really heard it, but it's a good term to use. But equality of opportunity is not the same thing as equality of outcome.
Right.
So, if you say give everybody the equality of opportunity, doesn't mean that you're saying give everybody the exact same thing, all the way across the board. No, it means, it kind of does, but only in the beginning. Give everybody a shot. If what they do with that shot, how they come out in the end, is on them. But at least they're given an opportunity. And I don't feel like we have that today.
Oh, no. But, it's so much more complicated. I saw where President Trump is issuing to do away with a lot of the regulations and able to put more toxins back into the environment and things like that. And so you're like, well, how does that play into this concept?
I was just thinking about this. So, movement conservatives, that's what she's calling this current peoples that are using the Republican Party tag, because they're not Republicans. They're movement conservatives. They've just hijacked the party's name, and it kind of confuses me. They're really passionate about bolstering the military, making us as big and as powerful as possible. Building a huge wall to protect our borders. In the South. All this protection, except not to protect our drinking water, not to protect our environment, and not to protect our workers' rights, not to protect us as citizens who work and try to make it in this country. They don't care about protecting that.
I can see where the vision gets kind of twisted. If you say all this regulation is in our way of doing the things that we want to do to make ourselves bigger, and if they believe in the idea of trickle-down economics, which you can debate whether or not that's actually a real Republican ideal or not.
Well, it was Reagan's thing.
Old school, if you will, before Reagan. Yeah, it was a Reagan thing, the idea that it would trickle down.
He really pushed it.
Yeah. So if you have this idea that, all these regulations are interfering with what they do, and they know how to run their business, then you're stepping on their rights. Okay? You're stepping on their ability to do the things that they want to do.
The businesses or the business owners?
The business owners. The businesses, okay. The business owners. It depends on the ones who are in control of that, who are petitioning for these types of things. Right? So now you can understand that, right? And then you've got the people who work for them, right? The lower and middle classes who work for them. And now, because we get this a lot here in West Virginia, you've got the coal industry. And so you've got now your livelihood is now in jeopardy if their livelihood is in jeopardy. And that's the way it's sort of spun. But the actuality is that, you're going to drink that water and you're going to farm that soil and you're going to breathe that air. And so to deregulate that is really going to hurt your rights as well. So you got to find the balance. And I think the movement conservative part has taken away that balance. One of the things that she talked about was that the early Republican Party actually created, the road systems. They were the ones that sort of pushed for that.
Yeah.
And, the Homestead Act and all these things that would have been regarded as under modern movement conservatism as socialistic, as communist, but they're very necessary. There's not a person in the United States that doesn't use a road that's funded by the government. And so, any argument about that being communism is kind of ridiculous.
Or socialism. In its purest form.
Yeah.
Well, these movement conservatives, they don't understand how regular working people operate. They don't understand, like that news story about the tweet with Paul Ryan, saying how wonderful it was that this, I think it was a school secretary, got an extra $1.50 a week on her paycheck due to this the tax bill that they passed. Really?
Yeah.
How out of touch are you that you think $1.50 more a week is this amazing thing.
Thanks, I could buy a pack of gum, but I can't buy a can of beans. You know. And I mean, maybe we sound a little more grouchy and angry about it, but I think it's because when you think about what she said about the Republican Party and what it used to be and what it stood for and what it stands for and what it is today, it is kind of infuriating. I never really gave Eisenhower, I guess, the credit that maybe he deserved. And actually that's part of what came down from that the whole movement conservative part, you know, where they take the concepts of family and business and, you know, a strong military, and then they twist it into, you know, well, Christianity and big business and big military. And it's sort of we get caught up in the labels and maybe the propaganda in that, and we've stripped away the original concepts. Basically propaganda, you know, in the way that movement conservatives have, the older movement conservatives have spun this, and we're starting to all buy into it. And how, you know, this party that was about this equality of opportunity, and, you know, the war was won, then there comes desegregation, and that was the moment where the Republican Party really kind of got broken.
The Republican Party before this current, you know, movement conservatives have taken it over. We had a lot of really awesome things like the New Deal and then the Middle Way. What I found interesting about that, you know, when we allow businesses in these non-Republicans who call themselves Republicans to gain as much power as they do, we have these economic downturns because they don't believe in equality of opportunity. They believe in pushing everything upward. Another thing that I found interesting that she had said, and if you really listen to some people talk, you'll hear this, is that these movement conservatives believe that the wealthy should dictate how society works.
Yeah, she actually said something to the effect of only the wealthy know how to run society in their ideology.
That's insane to me.
Yeah, it's not about your intellectual prowess. It's about your
wealth.
Your wealth. That doesn't make any sense. That's not American. No. And I think that makes us out of balance as a society. You know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It does put us out of balance.
And again, it comes back to some of the branding, because I think maybe sometimes we sort of start believing it, or at least we tie ourselves emotionally to, you know, the basic concepts. So, you know, the social structure of family, right? And then, what I was saying earlier, and big business and, you know, a military to protect us. And then, of course, we're not really regarding in the same concept. And, you know, why is that important? Well, I think what's happening is that when we talked about in our episode on denialism, is that becomes identity politics.
Explain to me what identity politics is again, Victor.
Identity politics is basically where you identify with a party or a social system just because it's that social system.
Okay, I got you. So with identity politics, it's like you like Dr. Pepper.
Oh yeah.
And if Dr. Pepper came out with you know, some awful version of Dr. Pepper, you would still drink it, and you would tell everybody it was delicious because it's Dr. Pepper, even though you knew it was awful. Is it kind of like that?
Yeah, I mean, it's like that. Would I do that? No, I'm a diehard. But I will say that the generic versions of Dr. Pepper are not anywhere close. So yeah, I mean, in a way, yeah. So Mr. Pop, Sergeant Soda, whatever you want to call the generic versions that are out there, they're not the same.
Yeah,
you know?
So the people who prescribe to this identity politics, that call themselves Republicans, and no matter what the Republican Party does, as long as they say they're Republican and they're doing it, they support it. And the same thing with the Democrats. You know, as long as the person doing it says they're a Democrat, if they identify as a Democrat, then they support them, regardless of whether or not it makes sense or if it's right or if it's wrong.
Yeah, I mean, and it's going on all over the place. You know, we're just focused on the Republican aspect right now because of this episode. But everywhere you go, you see that.
Yeah, I think we're going to find a lot of the same things when we delve into the Democratic Party.
Oh, definitely.
So, Victor.
Yes, Chris.
Guess who was mentioned in this episode?
Oh, no.
McCarthy.
Yeah.
Oh, I can't wait to do an episode on McCarthy.
Well, what's interesting is it wasn't just McCarthy that came up.
No,
it was William F. Buckley Jr. who wrote a book about McCarthy.
Yeah. William F. Buckley and his brother-in-law, L. Brent Bazell. It's
interesting because, the way that he basically sort of started this, again, I don't know how to say it, maybe a propaganda machine, this idea that everyone who believed in the New Deal was a communist, was a liberal with a big L, and she said that was tied to the idea of communism with a big C.
He also said that didn't he say that it didn't track with the Enlightenment? Because in the Enlightenment, anything could be accomplished with discussion. And he said that it doesn't track because, everybody's supporting this New Deal. And they shouldn't, because to him it didn't make any sense.
And then he started to didn't he start the branding of the media as liberal as well?
Mm-hmm. Big L liberal.
Yeah, big L liberal.
So not liberal as in liberalism, but the big spooky big L liberal that now everybody who gets angry. Anybody that is a big C conservative, that's what they say whenever you don't agree with them. You're a liberal. Yeah. Big L, liberal.
Well, it was, the idea was that he believed, and the movement conservatives believed that, the government shouldn't regulate anything. And because of that, that's why he was branding the media as liberal, because the liberal media, if you will, was trying to say, we have these regulations in place to protect the people. And so then that was it. It was about business. It was about branding.
Well, his father was a big oil man, so he probably had an ulterior motive in trying to get business back into this Wild West sort of area, because he was probably going to inherit his father's business.
Yeah. I don't know enough about Buckley.
I don't either, but we should definitely...
We're definitely doing an episode on Buckley.
And McCarthy. Another thing that she talked about, it was the Southern Strategy. So Strom Thurmond, Nixon, and the Southern Strategy. And there was these movement conservatives believe that civil rights should never have happened. The civil rights movement should never have happened. The civil rights laws that we passed should never have been done.
Because they were regulations.
I don't get that.
Yeah.
I don't get that.
I mean, I think because in their eyes, it's not about equality of opportunity. It's just about forcing people to do things they don't want to do.
Well,
you're coming out of the Southern Democrat ideology.
Yeah, and they say they're not racist. They say they're not racist, yet they didn't think civil rights should happen.
I think when you have when all of the things that occurred during the desegregation era, and how it was Eisenhower who backed it, and in a previous episode we were talking about it, and they said that he lost the South for the Republicans, right? Or something like that.
Yeah, that was Ultraman.
Yeah, Ultraman. Yeah, Ultraman said that.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because, it really did, but of course we know that there's different names for them now, the parties now, and the way that they fluctuated. But, Strom Thurmond switched parties, right?
Yeah, he was a Democrat turned Republican because of the Civil Rights Movement and the Voting Act.
And again, it all comes down to that's the way that the conservative...
Movement conservatives switched it. They branded it. It was like, oh, well, see, this wasn't about equality of opportunity. This wasn't about all the things that they said it was about. This is about making sure that the black people can be free and in our society and in our things. And it amazes me that with Brown versus the Board of Education, it's just a group of people who were not seen as popular were able to seize it and now spin this party in an entirely different direction. Yeah. It really just amazes me, Victor. It really just amazes me.
Yeah. And what's sad is that so now you've got this party that's emerged from this other party, this movement that has emerged from this other party.
I think it's they've just hijacked the Republican Party name. That's the way I feel about it. They're not Republicans.
And, one of the things that she said that really struck with me was that we need the two strong, healthy parties.
Yeah.
I mean, you need to have healthy dialogue, and without a healthy dialogue, we can't have a functioning country. It's just going to get more and more jacked up.
Well, at their core ideologies, they want the same thing. They just go about it in different ways.
Yeah.
At their cores. I don't believe that's what we have right now with Democrats or Republicans, but at their core beliefs.
Yeah, no, ideologically, I think that it's the same thing. It's just maybe different approaches on how to do it.
Yeah, but again, not what we have today.
No.
In either party.
No. And, if we're not even willing to meet at the tables, and again, I can't help but feel like that, on the Republican side, in name only, the conservative movement, conservatives.
Yeah, there you go.
Have really helped close the dialogue, certainly from that side, from us being able to do that. And it's sad because you have two great parties with two great ideologies, and they're supposed to work together. Mm-hmm. And we can't do that anymore.
Not today.
Not in this current set.
No. Hopefully in the future, though.
Oh, yeah. There's always hope.
Yeah. Well, listeners, that was Dr. Heather Cox Richardson. An amazing interview. A lot of information.
I wish we could have unpacked it all.
Yeah, it was a lot, but it was so good. So informative. Listeners, tell us what you think. Go to our Twitter, our Facebook, our Instagram, our website. Shoot us an email. All the links and stuff are in the show notes and on our website. Hey, Victor.
Hey, yes, Chris?
We got some more reviews on Apple Podcasts.
Oh, yeah? Who was that?
Kickball Master gave us a review. Thank you very much, Kickball Master.
Thank you, Kickball Master.
And I Can Show You the World gave us a review.
Aw, an Aladdin song. I have a daughter, and, well, I've watched a lot of Disney movies.
We'd like to give a special thanks to Stu Art and Design for our show's logo, and to Kiko's Last Smile for the music you've heard during the show.
We would also like to thank our guests for their time and insight, and a thank you to our listeners. Without you, this isn't possible.
Show your support by donating at our Patreon page at patreon.com/civildissonance, and head over to our website for a full listing of our episodes, transcripts, and more information about our guests and other supporters.
Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and other social media. Links are in the show notes and on our website.
And if you're so inclined, leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. And if you like what you've heard, tell people about us. I'm Christopher Nottingham.
And I'm Victor Polino, and you've been listening to Civil Dissonance, a Pro Thoughts production.
Now go out and start a conversation.
I like it.
Pretty good.